Hi everyone, welcome back to Current Affairs Unfiltered. I'm your host, Paige Fulman. We are deep in the shitstorm of the first weeks of Trump's presidency. I keep oscillating between angry and heartbroken and honestly just scared that my worst fears about what his presidency could have been has, appeared to be reality. But hopefully today's conversation will lighten the mood or at least attempt to put everything into a bigger picture. Today, we're taking a step back to get a broader, more philosophical view of the political landscape, especially when it comes to Donald Trump. Rather than focusing solely on what he says, we'll be examining what he actually does and the larger global context that shape his actions. Are we really talking about politics, or are we just discussing the forces that surround it? I'm thrilled to introduce this week's guest, Rafael Holmberg, who will help us unpack these big questions and challenge the way we think about political discourse. Rafael is a political writer and a researcher in philosophy and psychoanalytic theory. His work broadly combines political theory, French and Freudian psychoanalysis, and German philosophy. Rafael has written for a variety of magazines, newspapers, and journals, and has upcoming articles for Newsweek, Radical Philosophy, and The Philosopher. He also runs a regular blog, Antagonisms of the Everyday, via Substack. If you want to check it out, look in the show notes. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Rafael. Rafael, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
All right. I'm wondering if you can start by giving us kind of a summary or an overview of what your whole kind of thesis or framing is for the conversation that we're about to have.
Yes, I'll do my best. I think the thesis will probably slowly develop itself as we go along. The simple point is I think that there's a tendency now with tensions with NATO, with the Trump election, with contested ownership of Greenland, with the climate crisis, etc., to make somewhat of a point that in some way or another it's time to understand politics by itself. We've had decades of trying to think about it, of thinking, is politics always also economy? Should we call it political economy? And I think there's a sort of general tendency now to maybe say, well, look, now is the time to understand politics as it is. And my argument is that's the mistake, to suddenly suggest that now you can understand politics by itself. I think this is the fundamental mistake. Politics is internally open. It requires something of being interpreted in the sense that you have to apply a frame. If you approach politics by itself, you lose politics. You don't have the object itself. You're not talking about it anymore. In order to talk about politics, we have to frame it in relation to theory, philosophy, whatever else.
Thinking about that, what broader context do you think is driving the political landscape around Donald Trump?
Well, I think it's an interesting thing as well. You see a lot of this type of stuff, especially in sort of more center-left, I think liberal newspapers and magazines, which I remember in 2016 when it was still kind of ironic. There was this joke around Trump that, he's just narcissistic, he's a psychopath. And then when he actually got elected, it was even more, okay, he's really narcissistic, he's really, really psychopathic, he actually made it work. And I think the point is, it doesn't work like this. Yes, he might be narcissistic and psychopathic, etc. But the question isn't why is he or is he not narcissistic, or is he extremely humanistic? The question is, why is, in order to have narcissistic, psychopathic presidents or leaders, you have to have a frame, a system, or a groundwork that allows narcissistic people to exploit certain, ideological, economic tendencies and take positions of power. So it's not just a question of Trump himself. Trump's he's an interesting question, but what's more interesting is why can such a, performatively decadent and silly, self-deprecating figure who does it from, surely, I'm sure, from a narcissistic perspective, what type of system allows narcissism to take power? So it's not just a question about Trump. It's you have to situate Trump in a ground, in a system, in a framework that allows you to understand why narcissism has a certain political weight.
So obviously with his inauguration just over a week ago, there is a lot of focus on him as an individual. Do you think that that's kind of a distraction from the broader context that he's in?
Yes. Yeah. I think, not to bring up the sort of cult of personality thing and in any way compare Trump to Stalin or anything, but the point is, yes, when you focus on it, this is similar to, I think this is, Adorno writes this perfectly in Minima Moralia, where when you focus on this sort of virtual or sort of concentrated aspect of a thing, on Trump's mannerisms, even on his sort of decadence, on his or on his sternness, or on his whatever it is, whatever aspect of his personality that you find interesting. In order to have this focus, you have to exclude everything else. In order to care about one thing, you have to ignore every other instance of that thing. I mean, you have to centralize something at the cost of everything else. And I think the focus on Trump is probably very tactical. I don't think Trump is the first to do it, to create something, to say outrageous things in order to have people focus not on the reason why Trump might not in fact be a man of the people, but why he might be another strange short circuit in establishment liberal logic, whatever it is. But I think that the point is that the focus on Trump is very intentional, and I think it's, to me, it's what allows you to not actually think about Trump properly. Like, you zone in too much on Trump as a person, you can't actually think about what Trump means in that sense.
You mentioned a little bit earlier, kind of 2016 Trump. Obviously, I think it's very prevalent that we don't see the 2016 Trump anymore. He's clearly changed and evolved. I'm wondering if you can kind of go through that evolution a little bit.
Yes, I mean, I can do my best. I think there's a few factors. I mean, first of all, I think the more, let's say, sort of shocking aspect, at least from a theoretical perspective, is that generally from a, what Marx calls historical materialism, there was one sort of general trend that I think stuck, one phrase he had that stuck, which is that something along the lines of history and, great historical figures repeat themselves. One says tragedy, and he's giving, the famous example of the sort of great European tragedy of Napoleon Bonaparte had to be repeated in this sort of more ridiculous, sycophantic figure of his nephew, Louis Bonaparte, and that what was considered a great, almost cinematic ascent to the throne by Napoleon had this sort of more impotent and ridiculous, laughable recurrence with Louis Bonaparte. I think Trump is not in what he says, conceptually, is in this sense the greatest critic of Marx. What's obvious isn't that history recurs once as tragedy and then as farce. Is that Trump initially was a farce. He was initially a bit of a joke for the establishment, for people all over Saturday Night Live and talk shows, and you didn't take any of you didn't actually think that there was any sort of impetus in the Middle American belt to actually do anything about it, to care that much about this. And I remember even when I live in the UK, and I remember when he took office and visited the Queen Elizabeth then, that it was still, yes, fine, there was a sense of, God, we let this go too far, or something really went wrong with the democratic establishment to allow this type of Republican backlash, whatever, but there was still a sense that, neither the Republicans took him seriously, nor did even, when he went to see the Queen and he was sort of a buffoon and he was kind of stumbling around her, and, and the Brits said, God, this is not this doesn't even have the facade of a respectable, traditional Republican leader. And for Trump, he was this, he was still a buffoon, he was ridiculous. He was, in other words, precisely what Marx means by a farce. Now, something very different has changed. Now he is what you would call a tragedy. In other words, he has a certain establishment, structural, bureaucratic weight behind him that doesn't mean that pointing the finger and laughing at him now, although it was, yes, disingenuous then, it wasn't taking, the issue seriously. Now it's directly not just disingenuous, but offensive, even, dangerous in a certain sense, to still claim that this is just a bit of a silly farce. It's far more serious now. But the point is, in 2016, I think that the reason people voted for Trump in large part was exclusionist. They felt that the time, and this wasn't new either. If you look back at the campaign between Bush and Clinton, they're kind of similar in the 90s. They're kind of similar things were being said that, well, look, we want to de-escalate. We don't want to be this universal mediator of the rest of geopolitics. We want to focus on American jobs, America first, etc. And Trump appealed to this. And I think the irony now is precisely the same thing is being said, but it has a tone that is, the exclusionist tone is colored by the fact that it's anything but exclusionist. And first of all, the kind of the, let's say, backdrop to the 2016 exclusionism was something like, it doesn't feel democratic to have this, global hegemonic influence on other foreign economies and things like this. And I think there was a reason why even some leftists were sympathetic to Trump in 2016, why they said, okay, look, fine, he's this, extremely rude, pig-like buffoon. Yes, fine, there was this element of, I wouldn't like to meet him and to speak to this guy personally, but I think left politics was able to see something, okay, this is at least a new set of coordinates. Maybe it accidentally accords with the scaling back of foreign influence and interference and things like this that a more democratic politic would insist on. But I think, of course, this wasn't the case, that he stood for this. I mean, he had major globalist corporate funding. His lobbyists were in no way interested with more fine-tuned diplomatic domestic policy that would somehow benefit the working man. It was a lie from the beginning.
I think his rise in 2016 was a lot of why Bernie Sanders was so popular in 2016. Yeah. They spoke to the same kind of populist message, but with two totally different ways of going about it. Yes. And it's, in my opinion, the greatest tragedy that Hillary Clinton kind of mowed Bernie Sanders down, even though both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders were preaching these populist messages, and that was clearly what was resonating with voters, was populism. Mm-hmm. And she and her team just didn't get that.
No, I know. I think they made a sort of fatal error there. But then the thing that becomes more interesting is that on what Freud would call the manifest content and what you actually express, it seemed that Trump was, to an extent, a more democratic guy. Like he cared about the working people. He cared about American jobs and American first. And the irony is, in a weird way, we have the same figure of Trump. He mocks, he openly denigrates, he makes fun of things, he touches the untouchable. But any trace of exclusionism, although he still uses the rhetoric of America first, not only was he openly talking about eliminating political opponents, etc., but one of his first policy is essentially creating Latin America, North America, Greenland, and what he calls the America Canal, or the Panama Canal is now the American Canal. I mean, it's not exclusionism anymore, and yet it comes under the same term. And I think there's a inherent tendency for what is democratic in the sense of liberal democratic, exclusionist policy that focuses on that focuses on a sense of justice, although his was justice against the establishment, etc. I think there's an inherent tendency of that to become something imperialist, something proto-fascist in a certain sense, although I'm suspicious of the equating of fascism with Trump.
The term fascist, especially in the last week or so, has been used frequently to describe Donald Trump as well as his supporters. But from a historical or political perspective, or your perspective, do you think this is accurate? And if not, then how would you describe them?
I mean, I don't think it's accurate for many reasons. I think it's more paradoxical than that. I mean, there's you probably know very well of Alexander Dugin, Putin's brain, as they call him in Russia, the political philosopher who wrote, I think it was 2009, what he calls the fourth political theory. Alexander Dugin is the guy that justified the invasion, he says, because we're postmodernists, which is a strange, no one really knows, he never really explained it either. He says Ukrainian invasion is justified because we're postmodern. Either way, he wrote a book called The Fourth Political Theory, and he argues that we've had liberalism, we've had fascism, we've had communism, and now is the time for the fourth theory, which for him, he argues, is, well, I combine a little bit of fascism, a little bit of communism, and a little bit of liberalism, which doesn't make any sense. But in part, the reason it doesn't make sense is because it seems to, it puts them in what in structuralism you call a sort of synchronic perspective. It argues that they've always existed. Like, there's always been a question of, each state constitution is, do you pick communism or do you pick liberalism or do you pick fascism? The point is, whatever it was, the communist hypothesis, as Alain Badiou calls it, whatever it means, this hypothesis that there's an alternative between liberalism and fascism, but the insistence was that liberalism in some sense produces a fascist tendency. They're not opposed. One moves into the other. It's the fascism is the doppelganger in a certain sense of liberalism. And all of these points are always historicized. You have to see how one possibly relates historically to the other. And I think with Trump, the argument doesn't make any sense. I mentioned earlier that in 2016 he had a more leftist backing He had the backing of sort of the same type of people who might have possibly voted for Bernie Sanders. However, the greater paradox isn't just that he's shifted even more to the right now in 2024, 25. What's also ironic is that he now has the backing of American communists. And he now has the backing of, this strange, very strange phenomenon called MAGA Communism, especially in the circles where I publish and write and where we engage with each other. This was quite a prominent thing. Trump, the argument was fine. Trump on the surface was quite a, quite a brazen and confrontational figure in 2016, but actually what happened was he didn't have the Senate backing, he didn't have the general Republican backing for his administration, so it ended up being more of the same, just with a slightly more humorous face or with a more ridiculous face. The argument for MAGA communism now was essentially that now Trump has the actual chance to confront establishment bureaucratic politics. He now has a backing that is going to some sense sort of disseminate the sort of false narratives of the establishment bureaucratic Washington, of the Democrats. And so there was this phenomenon called, yes, we don't really like the kind of Republican aspect, but we think it's a new alternative, and therefore this thing called MAGA communism was born. And the reason I say it isn't fascism or populism is because, no one would imagine something like Nazi communism. No one can imagine this. It's not an alternative. In the same way, when you speak of populism, there's a kind of general understanding of populism. It uses, it cuts through social positions and broadly labels them left and right and says, the left have done this, they're woke, blah, blah, blah. And the right is more secure in its foundation. And this was what, for example, Javier Milei did or Bolsonaro did and people like this, which is that they moved through and broadly cut through various sort of plurality of social disparities and antagonisms, say, well, it's left and right. That's how we can neatly categorize everything. You wouldn't imagine something like Javier Milei communism. He was sat on Argentinian TV screaming about, the communists have ruined everything, which didn't make any sense, but it worked. This kind of the argument for against, as he saw it, we should have truly free market economies that we've never. Ironically, there was something he was correctly saying here. For example, Noam Chomsky, when he was asked once, "What do you think about capitalism?" gave this sort of light-hearted response, and Chomsky says, "What do you think about capitalism? It sounds like a good idea." And the point is, even accidentally, Javier Milei was repeating the same thing, saying, "We haven't had capitalism. We truly need to get rid of any form of state interference in the markets. We need to let the free markets decide for themselves." The point, and then he was blaming the communists somehow for having screwed this up. Now, as ridiculous as MAGA communism was, it worked. The coordinates were there for people to think that this is a possibility. There was something about Trump that is irreducible to Milei, to other forms of right-wing populism, even to fascism. And my argument for why that is, which I have a piece coming out for Newsweek within the next week, which makes the same argument, which is that the logic of populism is that you have a series of social demands, irreconcilable social demands, that they don't all go together. And the populist solution is to offer what Leclerc calls an empty signifier. In other words, an empty blank object that has nothing to do with any of them, and yet by being detached from all of them, can seemingly satisfy all of them. Like it creates this virtual solution by not being a solution at all. For example, in post-World War I, there was a general disorientation in economic and political and social systems in Germany, and the solution was simple: it's the Jews. The Jews did it. It sort of it displaces what's a sort of plurality of different demands and creates the same demand of all of them. It makes a multiplicity of demands all point at the same thing. Trump himself used this in 2016. It's all the Mexicans, for example. If we build a wall, things will calm down because, again, this was the exclusionist policy. But now he's doing something, I would argue, that's very different. For example, with his topics on Greenland, on the climate deal. If there's anything that's, I would argue, and there's so much work trying to suggest this, if there's anything that kind of suggests that everyone should be worried about it, especially the sort of working class, middle America, but something like climate change. This is the thing that works its way from the bottom to the top in terms of like social classes. I think you had the California fires. That was a bit of a shock that said, okay, though in Europe we had the floodings in Valencia a few months ago.
Yeah.
One Sky reporter actually said on Sky News, unironically, God, this is strange. This usually happens, somewhere in Africa or something. It doesn't happen in Europe. And the point is, there's this absolute resistance to getting that this is kind of serious. And, I think with the California fires, there was a sense that maybe there'll be this kind of rupture now in this ability to put it aside. And of course, that wasn't the case. The first thing the Republicans blamed it on was it's actually the Democrats' hiring policy that led to this.
And the inferring that you could just go turn on a spout of water and it would be fixed.
Yeah, precisely.
Okay.
Precisely. The point is that what Trump has done is he's pulling out of these deals. He's saying we want to get Greenland and things like this. And suddenly people care about this. Suddenly Greenland and the claim to the use of Greenland resources suddenly become a sort of everyday category for people. You saw in all of the street interviews on tariffs and why we should have, they didn't know what tariffs were. They said, we need tariffs, we need China to pay more to send products here. And that's not how tariffs work. It didn't matter. What Trump did was, he performs a great reversal of populism, is what I argue in the Newsweek piece, which is that he doesn't just see a series of demands and then say, well, it's like this is the solution and it's always a false solution. Trump instead provides solutions, which are his own solutions, or he just wanted it to be beneficial for him to have Greenland. He provides solutions, but then claims that they were demands within the population. So he doesn't just see a bunch of demands and give a false solution. He retroactively creates the demands from the solutions themselves. Suddenly people are talking about, with the woke thing, suddenly people are talking about, will my child become gay if they learn about LGBTQ rights? Or is it good for me or for the people for America if Denmark still maintains control of Greenland? The populist logic is that people have a set of personal demands. They see things wrong within their immediate lives, and then something falsely satisfies this. But the Trump logic, the sort of post-populist logic, is to, in fact, instruct the people on their own demands, to furnish the solution first, which then posits the demands, which then furnishes the demands which would lead to this solution. I think the case with, when this sort of spectacle of Greenland first emerged, and Elon Musk tweeted and said something along the lines of, any Greenland citizens that want to be part of America, you're free to. And this is what, for example, Jacques Lacan, the French theorist, has a great line on this, which is that when someone comes to rob you, and they say your money or your life, that's not really the alternative. I either keep my life or I give my life up and I keep my money. No, it's a forced sense of freedom of choice. Because in Greenland, you either openly accept that we're taking you, and then you can have the sense of becoming integrated into America, or we're doing it either way. So it's not, if you want to become American, feel free to. It's just, it's happening, and you can either accept it or, not accept it. Either way, it's happening.
I think, that's a framing for a lot of what he does, is like manufacturing these problems that weren't really problems that anybody was focused on. And then all of a sudden, it's all that dominates in the news, even though, from my perspective, I'm looking around and going, is this, I didn't care about this 2 days ago. This doesn't affect my everyday life. It doesn't affect many people's everyday lives. And yet that's all that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think the point is more that Trump's, of course people should be worrying about, economic structures and foreign events and things, of course, but the point is more that the things that Trump makes them worry about are only his own private concerns. For him and for his oligarch team and for his international lobbyists and funders, it's a great resource, it's a great advantage to have Greenland. It's not some great democratic move to acquire Greenland.
Well, and that's what a lot of news people and, kind of talking heads have been saying, to look at what he does, not what he says, because he says a lot of stuff. Not all of it happens most of the time, but, it is important to look at his actions, because his words are just his words. And a lot of times they are meant to just rile people up and get people talking.
Exactly. And I think one of the great performances that Trump puts on is to cancel out this difference, this difference that you used to have. You used to, in what classical, pre-Trumpian terms, have something like a unconscious of politics, in the sense that politicians would say something, and then there was always this slight game of what do they really mean? What's behind this? Trump, not only Trump, and not only Trump's administration, but something about the last, I'd say, I think, in fact, post-Afghanistan has had this effect where the Americas gone, okay, there are always ulterior motives. We're going to set it out straight. We're never saying what we're meaning, in a certain sense, or meaning what we're saying, whatever. And I think what's happening now is that there is no political unconscious in a certain way.
So speaking of those contradictions, Trump has, for as long as his political career has been, fought for the little guy, the working guy, but then surrounds himself, as he said earlier, with his little oligarchy squad of all of the rich people. So how do you explain that kind of contradiction, both, to him, and also how the real little guys see him with the wealthy people, see him with the elites, and still say, that's a guy that's fighting for me?
Yeah. I think this is where psychoanalysis, for me, is so important, because it's easy to say people are stupid. It's also easy to say politicians lie, where these sort of cliches and things like this that you often hear. Especially here in Europe, those American guys over the pond, they're stupid. No, we do exactly the same thing here. There's no difference whatsoever. And I think this is why psychoanalysis can explain things. It's not that if you somehow artificially, lower the intelligence, then these things take place. No, it has nothing to do with intelligence. What it has to do with, I would argue, is one of the sort of paradoxes of knowledge itself that psychoanalysis was able to discern, which is that sometimes you can know something without not actually knowing it. So for example, that Alenka Zupancic uses in reference to Freud, is a man is speaking to his wife, and he says to her, when one of us dies, I'll move to Paris. So the point being that he's fine. On the surface, he's admitting that, we're both going to die. But everything after that clearly shows that he's admitting that it's just her that's going to die. He can't himself die. And sometimes it's not only that we can sort of kind of know something but not have a complete understanding of it. The point for Freud and for Zupancic is that knowing something allows you to act as if you don't know it. And I think the point when it comes to why people vote for Trump, I think that it's two things. I mean, yes, there's this general concealment of his, it's not open news who's funding his campaign and the lobbyists. But also I think there's something that people kind of enjoy about seeing this person who openly embraces their own contradiction, who embodies the incompleteness of their own sort of doctrine in a certain sense. I mean, this is the writer G.K. Chesterton's argument of why orthodoxy is so, as an orthodox Christianity, is so appealing to people. It's because if you read the Old and New Testament and biblical literature, yes, it's fraught with sort of contradictions and bits that don't seem to completely add up very well. And it's very easy to then, become a heretic and, pick, well, I'm going to accept these few books of, whatever, of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And that if I selectively maneuver around this work, then I can have a sort of logically coherent doctrine. I mean, Chesterton's point is, what's more impressive is to be able to be orthodox, to see the contradictions, and to nevertheless sort of completely accept them and embody them. The fact that things don't always add up, and you can simply pick a portion of reality and say, this is the only one that makes sense, and somehow reject the rest of reality. What's truly, he says, impressive in a sort of in a literary sense for him is to be sane, to be completely sane. Because the sane man also sees the paradoxes and the things going wrong with reality, but is able to completely embrace them. And I think people see this type of orthodox logic in Trump, and it's all the more appealing. People see that he's not trying to conceal anything. There is somewhat of a contradiction. He speaks about exclusionist policy that's meant to benefit the working class. And then at the same time, he surrounds himself, not surprisingly, with the people who stand to benefit from an extremely unsymmetrical, biased mode of economic production. Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and other billionaires, the people who are really there to benefit from Trump. But I think people know this. They're not unaware of it. They're not kind of simply ignoring things. they find it even more, there's something even more radical about Trump as a consequence. There's something radical in the sense that it's not the same old Democrat politics where they're lying and there's this sleazy element to politics. I mean, there are interviews, you can watch them all over YouTube, of people on the tariff policy, for example, who initially, I support the tariff because I want goods to be cheaper in America, and China has to pick up the cost. And people say, well, that's not how that's not how tariffs function. China don't pay for the cost of importation. The American business pays for the cost of importation. And they explain this, and eventually they get it. Okay, so it's I was wrong. But then they double down in going, Trump is effective, because Trump is so, in a weird reversal, Trump is so effective that he's going, the first thing is he's putting people first. He's putting the American people first. And then in a sort of Leninist way, he's putting the people first at the cost of the people, in a certain sense. Like they then double down in their belief in him, because they go, well, even if it's going to cost me more and the consumers more, it shows Trump's true commitment to his own cause somehow. So the thing that appears to counteract the original thesis, let's say, the original doctrine, only even more supports it. It only bolsters that same doctrine. In the same, I think Trump is the master of this type of reversal, and I think the possibility.
Well, he just does the mental gymnastics that are needed to make it all fit together, and somehow the mental gymnastics are always there, and somehow they always go from point A to point B, and Trump is still the winner.
Yes, precisely. I mean, the capacity or the potential, the latent potential for it was there even in 2016. I think it was kind of heard around the world when Trump did this, because it was the first sign of this sort of disavowal, this kind of psychoanalytic logic that Trump embodies, which was, I think it was the second presidential debate with Hillary Clinton in October in 2016. And Hillary Clinton says something along the lines of, it's a good thing that a man like Trump is in charge of the law in this country. To which, any other politician would have said, well, I have better policy than you. Look what your policy has done, blah, blah, blah. He completely accepts the criticism and says, that's right, because you'd be in jail. It is a form of what Hegel would call a dialectical reversal, which is that when you have a thesis, let's say, and you oppose that thesis, you don't then get a new, higher unity. You find that even opposing it bolsters that thesis. In this case, the thesis would be Trump is a good, executive officer, for example. And then the antithesis, the rejection of this by Hillary Clinton is, no, he's in fact not. He's a very dangerous man. It's a good thing that he's not in charge of the law. The rejection of this isn't to then sort of go back and argue, in fact, yeah, I would be. It's to agree with the negation and show that even agreeing with the negation still is in defense of the thing. So by saying, yes, I completely agree with you, because you'd be in jail, shows that you're the really corrupt one. Yes, I'm corrupt, but you're really corrupt. And therefore, even your attempt to deny my suitability actually bolsters, it strengthens my suitability. Because you'd be in jail.
Well, it also, I think, discounted her because it pointed to her as being, well, that's why she's opposed to me, because she's corrupt.
Yeah.
Instead of making people think critically about, why are his policies bad? The argument then became, well, she doesn't like them because she's bad. She's her emails, whatever the story of the time was.
Yeah, and I think it's also, this type of thing works, and I think there's a tendency to maybe say it's because people don't want to think critically about it. But I would argue that in part the critical thought is there, but it's a truly dialectical thought, in the sense that it recognizes that the form of the argument is even more important in a weird way. So of course, I'm not saying, don't think about Trump's domestic and foreign policy, but I'm saying that this type of logic, where showing that even my opposition, the fact that I'm opposed, means that I'm even more right. This is what carries Trump. The fact that he seems like an anti-establishment figure, which he's not. He's the furthest thing from an anti-establishment figure.
Well, now he is the establishment.
Well, precisely. But people often think, oh, he's the outside voice. We
not anymore.
No. But fine. It was a bit awkward in 2016 because he didn't have the Democratic establishment backing, but he had the financial, political, economical backing. My argument is that it was never an opposition. Trump was the natural effect. He is one pole of the same system, economic system, that also produces this more bureaucratic Washington-style leftist politics. I wouldn't call it leftist politics, but both the same kind of thing. And but I think the irony of Trump is the excellency with which he embodies his own contradiction, that he can state both what we want to hear and what we don't want to hear and make it all the more effective. He can state that, yeah, of course I have ulterior motives. Who doesn't? Oh, yeah, he's telling the truth. And I think this is extremely, extremely effective. I think this is why people are orthodox more than they are any other type of heretical denomination.
So just to kind of round out the entire conversation, we've talked a little bit about how everything outside of just what we consider to be politics matters. So how would you kind of recommend that we, as American citizens, as global citizens, approach political discussions and what we're seeing in the news? How do we keep in mind that this is just a small part of the broader context?
I mean, I think it's a tough question because it's like how would I be my policy for helping the American people, which might seem a bit condescending, but I mean,
it's okay. We need it. We need somebody to just tell us what's going on.
No, I think that the one thing is that you often hear something like, "Oh, well, educate yourselves and read and things like this." And the problem is that knowledge, the Francis Bacon thing, knowledge is power. It's not completely true. What is all too often the case is that knowledge simply lends itself to power. It allows a type of power to simply continue. I mean, there are people who are relatively gifted thinkers, well-educated, and suddenly can be corrupted. Not even corrupted. I mean, the point is knowledge doesn't even get corrupted. It lends itself to being appropriated. You never just have knowledge for itself. You have something to which knowledge is always applied. So yes, I would say, of course, this element of value of being able to think critically and know the facts and things, but the facts presuppose a context to which the facts are applied. The facts are fundamentally malleable. There's no such thing as political information in its raw form. One piece of information can at the same time be in service of two opposed sides. There's no political fact or information by itself. Here's an example that I used in something else recently, which is Henrik Ibsen, the playwright, Norwegian playwright. He's not the best. He was a naturalist, not the best of the naturalists, but I like the example, not because of how the brilliance of the play A Doll's House. It's not a very good play, but because of the publication history of A Doll's House, which is very interesting. The story was a sort of semi-social critical commentary where a mother and housewife one day, after a long series of slowly coming to terms with the fact that she's very miserable as a housewife, sort of has an outburst one day and says to her husband, Torvald, I'm leaving. I'm leaving. I can't deal with this anymore. I'm leaving. To hell with you. Even I love them, but to hell with the kids. I just can't live like this. And of course, as you can imagine, in 1879, this was relatively controversial. A few actors refused to play the part of Nora, so Ibsen was forced to rewrite the play to make it fit better. In the alternative play, the plot develops in exactly the same way. She reaches the same sort of cathartic, violent outburst and says, I'm leaving, I can't deal with this, I don't want this lifestyle, I've been placed here as a sort of social category and I want to leave, and she's about to leave, they have a big fight and everything, and right at the end, Torvald says, well, just think about it one more time, just think about the children. One more time. And she stops and thinks about the children one more time and goes, okay, yeah, you're right. Yeah, I'll come back in. I'll come back. And it's almost like the thing that's so paradoxical is that the ending of the second, more conservative, traditional one is more critical and radical because it exposes more of an absurdity than the first, more supposedly critical one. My argument is that they're both bad. I mean, they both aren't great representations of what happens and what it means to truly act freely in a system that opposes free desiring and wishing and things like this. But when you're faced with two equally bad alternatives, where one is seemingly opposed to one, but even more critical than the first one, it's not that either alternative is bad. It's that the system that has produced the presuppositions that have produced the alternatives is itself bad. Like there's something wrong, not with each individual possibility, but with the context of the possibilities themselves. But anyway, the point I would argue here is that in relation to your question, on the one hand, it's not about so much asking another question, who is better? Let's read a bit more into Trump's policy, a bit more into the policy of the future opposition. It's to realize that when two alternatives are bad, it's time to no longer speak about the alternatives in a certain way. It's time to speak about the system, the context that produces these alternatives. And I think knowledge, it's more of an anti-knowledge, as Alain Badiou calls it. It's that you recognize that there is no golden point at the end of the rainbow where you have the total knowledge to be able to pick the best possible choice. It's that it doesn't exist. No, you have to step back from this frame of knowledge and to reject in-depth knowledge of each candidate, because you're already caught in the trap. When you're starting to analyze perfectly by an encyclopedic knowledge of what they voted for in the past, their policies and their time in Senate, whatever. When you're caught in this trap of too much knowledge about each candidate, you've lost the capacity to think of the frame itself. So you need to embrace a type of anti-knowledge, at least. And I think this is the political end. This is the clear psychoanalytic answer. You can't find the real cause of your problem is the fact that there is no actual fundamental cause of your problem. And I think the political sense is that you have to somehow recognize that to kind of reject knowledge in a certain sense and not stop knowing, but to embrace a type of anti-knowledge where you stop speaking about the alternatives and you speak about the frame in which the alternatives take place.
Yeah, and I think some of that kind of maybe started to happen around the 2024 election of people, kind of starting to acknowledge, okay, this is not working. Like we need to move past there just being two parties and look beyond Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. But, I think you're right to say that, but it's hard to fathom that in the United States there will be a complete overhaul of the frame.
But there's an alternative. Maybe Republicans and Democrats both need to storm Capitol Hill or something. You really have a kind of, this can't be explained according to party politics whatsoever.
Well, that's what the whole Luigi Mangione thing, where there was Ben Shapiro, the right-wing talking head, made a video and was like, liberals are praising him, da-da-da-da, and all of the comments from his own supporters were, Ben, this isn't a right and left thing. This is class solidarity. So I think there are starting to be those unifying moments that completely cross party lines and are starting to show just solidarity with the human. Mm-hmm. So I think that does make me hopeful that, people are starting to kind of take a step back and look at the frame and not say, the Democrats or the Republicans are the cause of my strife and anguish, but to say that this thing at large that has been created is the reason for my anguish and my issues.
Yes, yeah, and I like I'm always suspicious. I have some of my serious Marxist friends. They go, no, he doesn't work at all to criticize the system. I'm more sympathetic to the idea. I think it was a bit like the film Joker. I'd force people in a certain sense to say that, hang on, it doesn't work right if we're just saying, how can the Democrats and the Republicans somehow both have some type of sympathy with this thing? I think you need these pseudo events in a certain sense. It's not an event in the sense that, for example, Deleuze or Badiou, even more Badiou would say, in the sense that it has the possibility of a new opening, and if we're faithful to it, we might be able to pursue a complete restructuration. But they're not really events in that sense. But yes, I believe this. You should always blur the lines in a certain sense. You should always make things unclear, because Trump has made things very clear in a certain way. He's made it because he doesn't hide anything. He's made it clear in the sense that he can openly state, I want to eliminate my political enemies. I'm going to basically take Greenland, whether you like it or not. Yes, I stand for the people. Actually, I want to make money and blah, blah, blah. All of this, he openly say it. And things are almost too clear. We need an unconscious in a certain way.
Right.
I think to have events where the boundary between Republican and Democrat isn't clear is necessary.
Yeah,
one way or another.
Well, I think that's how we get ourselves out of this.
Yeah.
Hopefully, maybe.
Yeah, well, possibly. I mean, possibly. Or it sort of deepens. We then become truly like Alexander Dugin, and we sort of start embracing a little bit of liberalism, a little bit of fascism, a little bit of communism.
Thank you so much for coming on and talking to me and giving us a really philosophical, deep thought conversation. If people are interested, they can go check out the link to the article that you mentioned in Newsweek in the show notes of this.
Yes.
And read a little bit more of your writing. And then the Substack will also be in my show notes and the link in my Instagram bio. Everybody should go check out more of your work and make themselves feel a little bit more educated and have a little bit more of a thought-provoking conversation, because I do feel like a lot of these political conversations can get very mind-numbing when they're just hammering you with, the facts, the discourse that's going on. And I think after our conversation, I feel a little bit more at ease that, there's bigger things at play than just the discourse that we see.
I mean, ease isn't the effect I've been known to give people. So ease, I generally have, people feel more alarmed after speaking to me. But yeah.
I mean, I don't know if it's an ease, but I think it is good to, for me at least, to take a step back and see things are bigger than just Donald Trump versus the Democrats.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, I completely agree with that. Well, thank you for having me on here. It's been a pleasure to discuss with you.
Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Current Affairs Unfiltered, and thank you to Rafael for sharing his expertise and having a fresh conversation on a topic that, to be honest, is pretty beat to death. I'm walking away definitely feeling like I'll be able to take a step back when I look at what he does and says. And I also hope you guys feel a little bit more enlightened and empowered to look at it from a bigger picture. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, leave a review, or share it with someone who could use this information. And as always, if you have questions, topic suggestions, or just want to say hi, you can find me on social media at Current Affairs Unfiltered Pod on Instagram, or send me an email at currentaffairs.unfilteredpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Keep asking questions, stay engaged, and remember to keep moving forward. I'll see you next time in the briefing room.